Joseph and Emilio. We'll go to John Battles to introduce our next speakers. And if you have additional questions for this session, we can try to tackle some of those in the panel discussion.
Thanks, Jody. It's my pleasure to introduce our next two speakers. First off, we'll have Dr. Christy Brigham. She's the Chief of Resource Management and Science at Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park. Her mission is to help manage these two parks as healthy ecosystems into the future. One of her pressing priorities is to understand the threat posed by wildfire to the sustainability of giant sequoia. Dr. Brigham currently serves on the Science Advisory Panel for California's Forest Management Task Force and the Steering Committee for the California Landscape Stewardship Network. She also represents the Sequoia and Kings Canyon UNESCO Biosphere Reserve on the U.S. Biosphere Reserve Working Group. Our next speaker after Dr. Brigham is Professor Crystal Colden. She's a pyrogeographer in the Management of Complex Systems Department at UC Merced. Prior to her academic career, she fought wildland fires, and served as a federal research scientist in California and Alaska. Her current research focuses on reducing vulnerability to wildfire disasters globally through improved understanding of coupled human environmental drivers. Professor Colden is also an effective and enthusiastic science communicator on the intersection of wildfire and climate change. So great, so Christy, take it away.
Great, thanks, John. I first wanted to thank the organizers and all the other scientists of these workshops over the years. I have found them incredibly helpful. My goal with this talk is to just bludgeon you with the spaghetti of science and stress that is being a forest manager in the Southern Sierra. I turned off my camera because, like most of us in the Southern Sierra, we have crummy internet. So, uh-oh, it is not advancing. My slides are not advancing.
Okay, Kelly, you got them? Can you put up her slides?
Or I could stop and try again. I'm going to stop and I'm going to try to share again. And if that doesn't work, Kelly will take over and make the magic happen. Okay.
It's working, great. Yeah.
Only ate up a minute of my time. Okay, so I just first want to talk about, I'm going to talk about Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park and where we are with tree mortality. And then the main bulk of the talk will be about fire, the castle fire, and then bark beetles, and then some managery stuff at the end. So Craig covered this really well, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Forests are really important. Old forests are especially important. In Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks, at the start of the drought, I would say, I'm totally biased, but that we had an extremely well-managed forest that was in good shape. It has very little logging. We started managing with wildfire and prescribed fire in the 50s. We have a lot of old growth, mixed conifer. Despite all that, it's still overly dense. So we're able to burn about 1,000 acres a year. We should be burning 30,000 acres a year. After the drought, what's happening? So I came here in 2015, there were red, dead trees everywhere. And we started asking with USGS, and I think a lot of scientists were asking this, given that the forests were overly dense, is this tree mortality episode a problem ecologically? And these were the questions we were interested in. What was left? How many dead trees were there? Did we need to reforest? And what were the implications for fire? For Siki, the aerial detection surveys estimate about 5.8 million dead trees on our landscape. USGS started doing plot-based measurements to look at what was left. And in Sequoia Kings, it's not bad. We saw about 20% mortality across all species. It's still a forest. There's still a diversity of sizes and species. Based on that data and some additional data, our main concern right now from before we got to the fire implications is around sugar pine. We lost a lot of large sugar pines. The beetles preferentially attacked large sugar pines. They weren't super common on the landscape to begin with. So we have concerns about sugar pines. And additionally, all 5 needle pines because of these interactions between beetles, fire, and blister rust. So that leads to the next phase of fire and fuels. So for drought mortality, for us, it was not equivalent to what wildfire would have done, but the forest is still there and we don't see a need to take drastic action post drought mortality in terms of reforestation. So fire, I'm going to specifically talk about giant sequoias, which are extremely fire adapted. Prior to the 2012 through 2015 drought, we saw very little instance of wildfire killing large sequoias over 4 feet in diameter. There was a historical fire in Mountain Home around 1297 that may have killed a few monarchs. We had a fire in 87, the Pierce fire, that had a lot of logging slash associated with it that killed 14 monarchs. So very little. But then in 2015, we start getting these post-drought wildfires that start to indicate that we've got a problem with fire and fuels killing these, getting into the canopy and killing these large trees. So the rough fire, the pier fire, the railroad fire. And then in 2020, all hell breaks loose. So Crystal has asked the question with her title, was the 2020 fire season really a catastrophe? I think that's a great question. And rationally, I do not have an answer, but I can tell you it certainly felt like a catastrophe. So in this one fire event, we had 22 sequoia groves that saw fire, 12 on NPS, including a spot fire in Eden Creek, and then 10 on the forest. We saw 13.5% of high severity fire on NPS groves and 40% on the forest in their groves. Here's just a map showing you the outline in red of the Castle Fire and then all the groves that it got into. So what does this mean for mortality? We have all of our sequoias in SEQI mapped by stems. And when we look at mortality rates in the literature, what we see is the normal background rate for giant sequoias monarchs is really about 0.1% per year. It can be as high as 1%. It's not commonly that high. In a first entry burn where you haven't had fire for a century. In 2015, we see that really after 2015, pre-2015 wildfire mortality, the highest rate we've seen is 9.5% in that Pierce fire. When we look at the Castle Fire, where we can actually calculate this for NPS groves, we're looking at loss of monarchs between 36 and 73%. This is what it looks like in terms of spatial variability. So in the three of the highest burn groves, Homer's Nose, Board Camp, and Dillonwood, we see these patches where we've lost all the monarchs. And you can contrast that to Garfield Grove that had more of we think what will be a beneficial surface fire. So what does that mean for monarch mortality overall? We don't know how many monarchs there are range-wide. A pretty crummy spatial-based estimate is somewhere between the range of 56,000 and 90,000, which means that in this one event, immediately post-fire, so not even considering delayed mortality, we may have lost as much as 3 to 4% of the total monarch population, which is important for all the reasons why these trees are important: carbon, water, social, and it takes 1,000 years to make a new one. So what are our concerns post Castle Fire? We're very concerned about stand recovery. They're in this high severity burn areas, we may lose the seedlings that show up because of erosion. There may not be any seedlings. And since the canopy trees have been killed, there's no replacement of those. We saw similar effects. We have about 120 acres of that in sequoias. For sugar pine and mixed conifer, in fisher habitat, we have 600 about acres of large high severity patches. Switching gears to talk about beetles, this is work that Nate Stevenson is writing up as we speak. What we found in SEQI are 33 dead monarchs that died standing, starting in the drought, but continuing past the drought. All of these trees, they're all large. They were all in areas where there was either wildfire or prescribed fire in the previous decade. All the trees recovered from that fire and then subsequently died during the drought or after the drought. They all have signs of severe fire damage, which a lot of sequoias have. The majority are in very wet areas, and they all show signs of beetle attack. We were able to collect beetles from living tree branches in only one tree because they die so quickly that you can't climb them and get the material. So what does that look like? I just wanted to show one map from Giant Forest showing that some of these trees, you have a beetle-killed tree surrounded by living sequoias of a similar size with similar fire damage. And in other places, they're clumped. These are the beetle galleries, some of the fire damage. This is a fire return interval departure map for the whole range of giant sequoia, with the groves outlined in black, showing that a lot of groves have significant fire return interval departure. They've missed a lot of fire. So what does that mean? We're looking at potentially loss of a lot of 2,000-year-old trees. We typically use broadcast burning as our preferred treatment method, and that's what we would like to continue to do. But now we've got, as Leaf and Emilio talked about, previously unseen fuel loading that could impact how these fires behave in both wildfire and prescribed fire. And now we're concerned that fire, any kind of fire, could be making these trees vulnerable to beetle attack. So what should we do? We need to prioritize where we want to treat, given the small amount of area that we can treat. We need to increase the pace and scale of treatments. We want to look at new approaches, mechanical, winter burning. We need to closely monitor all these treatments, given how rapidly things are changing. And we're doing extensive research into the beetle problem. So what are the constraints? All these articles came out after the Castle Fire saying you need to burn more, treat more. Yeah, we know that. It's not easy. So there are some data gaps. We need very spatially specific ideas about where the fuels are and how they're going to affect fire behavior in order to prioritize the right area. We need to know more about drought vulnerability. Of course, we don't have enough money. Of course, we don't have big enough burn windows. We're afraid of unanticipated consequences like beetles, and there are a lot of constraints from a compliance standpoint. To end with a long list of what we're trying to do. So we're working on a lot of fire and fuels modeling. We're doing intensive fire effects sampling to understand what these new fires mean. We're trying to create STEM-specific dead tree maps. We're getting back into sequoia groves to look at coarse woody debris and stand condition. We're hoping to start landscape scale fuel sampling for the parks. And we're hoping to integrate what we're learning with these other statewide efforts in SEEKs and pyrogens. And we're continuing to do broadcast burning, trying to do more first entry burning, looking at water sources for the monarchs that are being burned and how that changes pre and post burning and how that might affect sap flow. And then we're doing a lot on beetles. We're looking at bark beetle genetics to see if this is a subspecies that's specific to sequoias. We tested one set of beetle attractants last summer that didn't work. We're going to test a new set to try and look into, can we trap and protect individual trees. We're continuing to look at monarch mortality, and we'll be treating sugar pines in the Castle Fire with anti-aggregation pheromones. And Adrian Doss, who's in this meeting, I think, is working on drought tree mortality prediction. And the Battles Lab is helping us with some sugar pine vulnerability and evaluation. Woo, okay, that was it.
Great, thanks, Christy, right on time. All right, Crystal, you're up. Do you want to share your, can you stop sharing your screen, Christy?